the reality is it doesn't matter what we think, it's what the client thinks.
Business of Architecture, episode 281. Hello and welcome back, Architect Nation. I'm Enoch Sears, and this is the show where you'll discover tips, strategies, and secrets for running a profitable and impactful architecture practice. Today, we speak with Dan Stine, who's the best-selling author of 12 books, including the #1 Revit academic training textbook. In today's episode, you'll discover an interesting career path within the architecture industry. Dan is the BIM Administrator at LHB, a 250-person multi-disciplinary firm with 4 offices. My conversation with Dan highlights the many different career paths that are available within the industry of architecture. So perhaps if you feel like the traditional architecture career path isn't for you, then you're going to find this interview to be highly valuable. We also touch on other technology-related issues like virtual reality, augmented reality, and all sorts of other cool things. So before we jump into that, however, I wanted to tell you about a podcast that you may want to check out if you're an architect, designer, or someone interested in the world of design. And since you're listening to the show, I assume that that is you. David Lee and Marina Borderine host the Midnight Charrette podcast, which in their own words is, quote, an explicit podcast about design, architecture, and people, but be warned, it's often not safe for work, end quote. Well, I know David and Marina personally as they've attended a couple of my seminars. Listening to David and Marina reminds me of late night conversations hanging out in studio. They have conversations between themselves and they also invite guests to the show. If you're looking for witty insider commentary that is at times thought-provoking and disturbing and at other times lighthearted and entertaining, check out the Midnight Charrette in your favorite podcast player. And with that, let's get on with today's show. Dan, welcome to the Business of Architecture.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, Dan, you are a registered architect, and as well, you work for LHB. Give us an understanding. Who is LHB? Tell us a little bit about the firm.
Yeah, LHB is a 50-year-old firm based out of Duluth, Minnesota. We have 4 offices, one in Superior, Wisconsin, another one in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then Cambridge, Minnesota. 250 people, multi-discipline firm. We do architecture, mechanical, electrical, structural, interior design. We have civil engineers that do roads and LA and bridges and industrial, and we have survey crews. So quite a variety of services that we provide here.
Is there any one project type that's kind of a mainstay that you all focus on more than others?
No, not really. Within our architectural group, the integrative design team, we have some specialty groups: healthcare, education, housing, commercial/government. So each of those groups do a pretty good job of focusing on those specific types of projects. Right now, we're working on a nearly $1 billion hospital in conjunction with a firm out east called Ewing Cole. It's been pretty exciting.
Where's that located?
Right here in Duluth. It's replacing the hospital that I was born in.
That's coming home.
Yeah, it's really great.
And I've worked on a number of hospitals. $1 billion hospital is a lot. What does $1 billion get you today?
Well, it's a pretty large brand new facility that's going to be nearly 20 stories, and it's a lot of this information's on the hospital's website, so there's nothing really secret about it. Essentia Hospital, it's called Vision Northland, which is the new facility. And one thing that I've been heavily involved in myself is a lot of VR experiences for the doctors, nurses, and staff at the facility, looking at ORs and inpatient rooms and just getting a sense of room scale based VR. It's been really pretty cool.
Tell me about that.
Well, we've been doing VR for quite a few years now, a little over 3 years. In fact, Dell, the computer company, sent a 7-person production crew to our Minneapolis office for an entire day to make, I think in the end it was about a 3-minute marketing video of an AEC firm using Dell hardware to engage in VR. And in that particular project, we were working with United Properties based out of Minneapolis. They're also the company who owns them also owns the Minnesota Twins. So they were building a large office complex conveniently right next to our Minneapolis office. And part of that story was bringing in clients and the developer, basically the developer in this case, to see the building, and then they bring in tenants to see the building before it exists for potential leasing opportunities. So yeah, that's what we've been doing with VR. We also have been using augmented reality, which is the Microsoft HoloLens. We probably will be using that on the healthcare project as well. We used it recently with a rock climbing wall company that they were able to go to this warehouse and basically walk around an empty warehouse and see the holographic projection to scale and get a sense of where the climbing walls were going to be and the perspective of where the reception desk is and some of the other amenities like the locker rooms. It's been pretty fun stuff to work on. Our clients are just eating it up. It's new to everybody, so it's when you bring it up as a service, it's something that they haven't heard of and don't quite understand the value at first. But once they've tried it, it's just for this hospital project, I have 20 hours of VR services booked right now over the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Wow. What is your job title right now at LHB?
My title is BIM Administrator. My main role is to provide training, support, implementation, and various other things. I've done limited liability LLA training with our in-house attorney for staff to understand when and how to share documents like Revit models and Civil 3D files. So I get involved in quite a few things. I don't think I mentioned this. I think we talked about this previously, but I started in the industry in 1991. So I have a few years under my belt.
What was your first position in 1991? Just give us a little bit of backstory.
Sure. It was, as you may know, it was right about the time of a fairly decent recession was about to hit. And the firm that I had started working with just was awarded a project to do a fairly sizable county jail. So I spent the first year of my career working on hand drafting mostly. The first AutoCAD station was actually still in the box when I started there. So I did a fair amount of hand drafting and some CAD drafting, the floor plans with printing with a pen plotter. And I worked there for 5 years, and it was a really great opportunity to get a lot of experience. We also did a maintenance facility that's based here in Duluth. It was about a $60 million maintenance facility for Northwest Airlines, which was then shortly thereafter acquired by Delta. And we worked with a company out of Chicago called the McClear Corporation. And then another firm that I worked at previous to LHB, it was really interesting. We had the opportunity to work on a lot of architect of record type projects with some pretty prestigious firms like LMN Architects and Caesar Pelle's office out of New Haven, Connecticut. He designed his firm along with Ann Gatlin Haynes. She was the project architect, designed the Weber Music Hall at the University of Minnesota here in Duluth.
Awesome. And you picked up Revit very early. I'd like to dive into this concept of when did you decide that you wanted to steer more towards the administration side of training others in software tools as opposed to going what we might traditionally think of as the architectural route?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It kind of happened organically, I would say. I've always been interested into technology things. I have a webcam in my urban chicken coop in my backyard right now, and we have Alexa and the Ring doorbell, um, and for a time I was also going to University of Minnesota for computer science, so that's always interested me. And then my daughter was born, so I decided to back off on a whole another parallel career. So I don't really do much in the way of actual programming, but what I do right now is really satisfying to me because it really everything I do, not just at LHB, kind of complements each other. In addition to being a full-time BIM administrator at LHB, I also teach graduate architecture students at North Dakota State University. Previously, I taught for 12 years at Lake Superior College in their architectural technology program. I've been at NDSU for 5 years now, and I've also taught in their interior design program. And then, kind of juxtaposed to all of that, I've written 12 textbooks, and 2 of them are on AutoCAD, 1 on SketchUp, 6 of them are on Revit, and 2 of them are hand sketching based books, which is kind of unique. One of them has some sketches in it from a few fairly well-known architects, and so, anyways, that whole idea of sharing knowledge and helping others be efficient, and the reward that comes from that, just by people saying thanks a lot, it's really helped my career, is something that I enjoy. And then I also write a blog that we talked about previously called BIM Chapters, and I get into all kinds of things there. It's fairly Revit centric because that's my world, but I'll talk quite a bit about energy modeling and lighting analysis. A lot of those are, again, still in the context of BIM. So that's, I think that pretty much sums up the answer to that question.
Earlier, you mentioned augmented reality and then virtual reality. Describe for us the difference between those two.
Sure. Virtual reality would be something like the Oculus Rift. Interestingly enough, before I was getting ready to meet with you, I was doing some extra testing for a meeting that I have scheduled on Monday. So the Oculus Rift, the device by Facebook, the HTC Vive, and then there's also the newer Microsoft mixed reality headset. Those are headsets that basically cover your eyes and you can't see your surroundings. So it's a fully immersive environment. It's very crisp and bright, and there's sensors that track how you're moving in space. I tend to prefer the HTC Vive because it's room scale VR, and a person can walk around on this floor that I happen to be on over in our architectural studio. We have a large multi-use space, and hanging from the ceiling 22 feet apart are the sensors for the HTC Vive, and we have a wireless headset. So within that 22-foot diagonal, a person can walk around. So if they're in a workroom or behind a reception desk, they can really get a sense of the space, and every step is one-to-one. They have wireless controllers. They can click and teleport themselves when they can't go past their physical space that they're in. So that's virtual reality. And then augmented reality is mainly the Microsoft HoloLens. There are a couple other options out there, but Microsoft HoloLens is the big one. And it's still really a beta product. When we first started using the Oculus, it was what you'd call a beta product. It wasn't considered an official consumer product that you could just go to Best Buy and buy, for example. And it's an entire computer that sits on your head. It's never actually been connected to a real computer. So the whole computer's on your head. The model is loaded via Wi-Fi into the headset. And then depending on what kind of software you use, when you load the model, you basically see a hologram version of it. And the headset has sensors on it to track surfaces, like the surface of a table or a wall. So you can basically stick that model onto the surface of the table, and walk around the model. If more than one person has a headset, they can all be looking at it from their own perspective. And then you can also make that hologram life size. And what's really interesting about that is you could walk around the entire floor of this building, which is like, I'm not even sure how big it is, but it's quite large. We have 100 people just on this floor. So you can walk around the entire floor and be in the model. It has its own sensors for tracking where you are in relative space. The big drawback to that is it's just not as bright. It's not as vivid as a fully immersive VR. But nobody's ever gotten motion sick with this because you still see your surroundings. There's almost no chance of running into a table or when you're walking down the hallway, the real hallway in a virtual hallway. You can still see where you're going, but it doesn't work outside. You can't really take it outside because the contrast. Just like the shades we had to pull behind me before we started this interview, the HoloLens wouldn't work in this room when it was that bright. We have to pull the shades, and so those are the challenges that we deal with.
What are you finding that clients, how are they reacting when they go through this experience?
Right. I actually gave a presentation early last year at NVIDIA's GPU Technology Conference in Silicon Valley. And they asked me to come and talk about the title of the session was practical applications of VR in the architectural industry. And when I started, the first slide was meant to just be a little bit attention getting. It said, it doesn't matter what you think. And that's one of the questions I get a lot from my peers, other architects and people in the industry. Well, do you think it's really worth it? And the reality is it doesn't matter what we think. It's what the client thinks. And we've had now a U.S. senator in our office and other various clients and politicians in here. And we've used it about a year and a half ago on an urban street renewal project where we brought it to a public meeting. So we've had not just clients, but the general public and other various stakeholders using VR and to basically review a project that doesn't exist yet. And they've loved it. Everybody's really liked it a lot. Every once in a while, you'll have somebody who gets a little motion sick, but there's others who really just don't want to try it. So they can vicariously experience it by watching the computer screen or the monitor. Whatever the person in VR is looking at, you also see on the monitor. But for the most part, it's worked out really great. There's some other things like people with glasses and different hairstyles that can make it challenging to make it accessible to everybody. But we've had enough experience now where we can deal with most of that in a pretty good way, I think.
Have you noticed any difference between how clients perceive their projects in terms of their positive sort of affinity towards the project based upon going through either the augmented reality or the VR?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I sort of wrote about that. I write most of the blog posts for Enscape. It's the real-time rendering engine for Revit, Rhino, SketchUp, and ArchiCAD. And basically, one of the first paragraphs in just basically using VR as a presentation tool stated that the clients and the stakeholders can really walk away from that experience with a more confident appreciation for the design team and their progress. So it really helps get to a point where you're getting sign off quicker because a lot of people aren't trained to understand 2D drawings as you well know. So trying to explain the layout of the floor plan and the volume of the space, and when you can then juxtapose that to VR, it's just everybody gets it. It's really easy to understand, and we have different programs for that. Some of the programs allow us to list dimensions in VR and even pick up furniture and move it around. And then some of the software is really just more about aesthetic, really good looking graphics and then just navigating that space. So lots of interesting opportunities there.
Do any of them have zombies in the VR spaces?
Well, not exactly. We do have 3D people that we can drop in. They're not necessarily like animated. And one of those people that I have the opportunity to drop in is a full 3D scan of myself, which is kind of funny. And Fuser, which is another, it's one of the VR tools that we use. They took that scan and basically hooked me up to make it animated. And so if you buy that software, there's an avatar in there called Dan Stine that you can walk around the model, but I wouldn't call it a zombie.
Awesome. And what are some of the software programs that people are using to do this?
To do VR?
Yep.
Well, there are quite a few now, which is really what makes it so compelling in our industry. Is you can basically click a button in Revit from your live single point of truth BIM and be in VR in like 15 minutes on almost any size project. So there's, I already mentioned Fuser, Enscape. Other tools that are pretty popular out there is Iris VR, that's based out of California. There's Revisto, which is a cloud-based issue tracking software that has the ability to push its version of the model into VR. And there are some gaming engines that are really, if you want to make ceiling fans move and doors open, you can use Unity and I forget what the other one's called, but there's two big gaming engine opportunities, and one of them has been working on a plugin for Revit to make it easier to transport the materials. But all the software we use, everything is done in Revit, and then you basically push a button and all the textures and the transparencies and even the photometry associated with the light fixtures is understood and brought into the virtual environment.
Wow, that's amazing. It's quite incredible the way how far things have come and how you can have these sort of visualizations. Dan, let's talk about training. What's the importance of training staff and people in use of these technologies and use of BIM in general?
Well, that's really why I reached out to you when I've been listening to Business of Architecture podcast. You've talked about this, and a number of your guests have talked about sort of a parallel concept, the gap that exists in the profession. In your case, you're focused on the business side of things, and a lot of your guests have said, well, that's not really taught in architecture school, and not quite to the same degree, but in architecture school, a lot of people don't have a full-blown Revit class. So when they come out of school, they're a little bit challenged to get up to speed quickly, and that's where I come in. Just this week, in fact, I went to our other office in Minneapolis and spent 2 days there training a new hire that had graduated architecture school a few years ago and sort of went a different path than the traditional path. And so what's exciting to me about LHP is they're not really just looking for somebody based on knowing a certain program, or they obviously have to have a certain credential, but they want to find the right people. And so we hired somebody, and I had the opportunity to go spend 2 days, and not that they didn't know any Revit, because 2 days is not adequate to get somebody completely up to speed, but to go through our standards and how we do things and our workflows. That's that is what helps make LHB more efficient, is doing training like that. And then on top of that, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, just to kind of set the stage for this next part of the discussion, I did a presentation last October in Ljubljana, Slovenia, and I was fortunate enough to be selected as the number 2 speaker for a topic that I am pretty passionate about. So I'm happy that it was well received. And the topic was implementing early energy modeling for architects, basically. We are a multidiscipline firm, and we have mechanical engineers that do really detailed analysis using tools like train trace. But we have the opportunity, and as a firm that's pretty highly focused on sustainable design, actually in our Minneapolis office, the Minnesota staff, the paid USGBC staff are actually in our office through donated space. So they have a few cubicles over in one area of the office. And so we've been working hard to try and implement early energy modeling. And so the whole presentation was on really how that was done and the training. And it obviously always needs to start with a high level of buy-in from management. And in a lot of ways, in our case, they were really the ones. Rick Carter in our office, he was one of the first people in the country inducted into the LEED Fellowship. And so he's clearly very interested in influencing this. And so he would even come to the first training session. And in our Duluth office, he remoted in through Skype. But having buy-in and then having specific times set up to do the training is really important. And what I mean by that is not necessarily having the training be over lunchtime and unpaid. Those are the 2 worst things, in my opinion. If you're trying to implement something that's important to the company and can make the company more efficient, in my opinion, it needs to be during the regular hours, and the staff need to be paid for it. And that's going to encourage them to show up, and it's going to be better for the company. So the next thing then is documenting the training. In our office, we have an LMS system, so a learning management system that's cloud-based, and there's a lot of canned material, and some of that's able to count towards continuing education credits for our engineers and our architects. But then we have the ability to put our own content into the system. So these trainings that I did were recorded and then put in the system. So this new lady who just started earlier this week, she has the opportunity now to go and watch those, as she has time. And then the other thing that sort of relates to that is, of course, staff buy-in, and just based on what I've already said, and our Minneapolis office being LEED Platinum, we have staff that are pretty, green-minded, if you will, sustainably designed, focused. So it wasn't like too hard to get this going, but there are some competing products. So some of the challenges were like the softwares that we decided to use, Autodesk's Insight 360 tool versus another tool that some other staff have used in other firms or in school, like Sapphira, or the European product IES. So there are some challenges related to that, but providing support then once the training's done, so that people don't get frustrated and just sort of want to give up, and then documenting some of those findings. One thing that I did is worked with our in-house mechanical and electrical engineers to determine what some of the common inputs are for doing the early energy modeling. Things like the lighting efficiencies per square foot, and the HVAC systems, and which project type. So on healthcare, the air exchange the outside air should be this value, but on a retail project, it might be this input. And then also, what are the Minnesota State Energy Code minimums? We obviously need to start there and then work up from there. So lots of interesting opportunities related to training. That's just one kind of specific topic.
Hey, Architect Nation, real fast, I want to draw your attention to May 1st through the 3rd, 2019. I'm hosting the Architect Business Summit in Chicago, Illinois, and I would love to meet you there in person. During these 3 days, some of the most successful architects I've had the pleasure of working with will pull back the curtain to reveal what they're doing to grow their income, freedom, and impact as firm owners. This will be the must-attend event for architecture firm owners in 2019. You won't want to miss this. Go to businessofarchitecture.com/live to get information on who will be speaking and find out how to grab your ticket. What LMS did you end up using for the firm?
That is a really good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I know at NDSU we use Blackboard, which is a really big, popular one. And for my books, I provide LMS modules for the end of chapter questions that instructors can use. But I wasn't involved in setting that up. So it's really presented, as a finished product that most staff wouldn't know what that is. I'm sure if I looked, I could figure it out, but I actually don't know. We branded it the LHB SOAR. So that's what people see as a name.
Yep. Gotcha. What recommendations would you have, Dan, for implementing a training program that actually impacts the operations of a business?
It depends on where the firm is. When LHB first started using Revit, that was like 14 years ago, and nobody knew it. We weren't able to hire people that knew it. So we were having weekly training sessions that were paid, and eventually it became every other week, and then eventually it was once a month, and we did that for probably 6 years. And then once everybody got to the point where, well, the only thing we can cover is like really complicated topics that not everybody needs to know right now, or we're repeating things just because there are a few new staff. Then we went to our current state of affairs where we might do a training when the new version of Revit comes out or some other software. And then I do a weekly Revit tips email, and not so much for our AutoCAD. So we still have a lot of people who use Civil 3D for site design, which is AutoCAD based. But on the Revit side of things, we have a weekly tip, and any the different project teams have lessons learned where they'll talk about problems they had and how they might have set it up differently ahead of time. So like I said, it kind of depends on where the firm is. Today, there's a lot of opportunities to hire people that are quite skilled in building information modeling and the various tools, energy modeling and lighting analysis and virtual reality. So that aggressive training that we did several years ago probably wouldn't be applicable to most firms today. And it also depends on if you have a me in the office in the sense of a Revit manager, a CAD manager, a BIM manager. That's obviously, in my opinion, I'm a little biased, but the best scenario, because you have somebody training, very concisely to what your company's standards and goals are. There are opportunities to hire specialists. Some of them would be associated with like an Autodesk reseller, which they have, very capable individuals, but they don't necessarily know your standards. So your training isn't as honed in to what your company needs, which would be kind of also similar to going to a conference and sitting in on some sessions. Those kind of situations aren't, in my opinion, typically ideal for a new user. Those are somebody who is intermediate to advanced and really want to be able to pick up some additional things that they don't already know. And then there's some specialists out there that don't necessarily work for a reseller, but have worked for different firms and have gone out on their own. They're quite a bit harder to find. I know these people because I've met them at conferences and talked to them via LinkedIn and Twitter and things like that. So those are the main training opportunities, I think, in the context of design software.
So BIM has a lot of advantages, and you've described a lot of the powerful things that it can do. Does using BIM save time compared to a similar workflow in 2D CAD?
Well, when we first started using it, I would say it was taking about the same amount of time or probably longer. And we were still benefiting, though, from better coordinated documents. You're basically, as you are well aware, creating a 3D model, and that model has information associated with it, and the byproduct is the 2D drawings that the contractor bids from. And now, depending on the contractor, there's the AIA E200 series contracts, and you get all the way up to the most sophisticated one where the model is the contract and the printed drawings are the just for reference, basically. So there are a lot of those opportunities out there.
And so it started out that it was, you said it took slightly longer now?
Oh, yeah. So sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So now I would say we're much more efficient. And in fact, I know I keep plugging various things here, but they're all just real things. And about, I would say 8 years ago, our mechanical electrical group started using Revit pretty much right when it became available. And it was really challenging. There was a lot of limitations in the software to do things per code, like the NEC code. And we really worked hard to make consistent content that had formulas, to calculate the apparent load and have power factor values. And we actually got to the point where we were kind of patting ourselves on the back and said, we should sell this. And I went to my supervisor, who's the COO of the company, and much to my surprise, he said, okay. So we partnered with CAD Technology Center, which is now called CTC Software, and they've been selling it basically in a partnership with us for 8 years, and firms all over the United States have purchased this package and use it on their projects. And so from that perspective, you're able to create these documents that are mostly code compliant. There's always limitations in software, but people are finding value in it, obviously, that they're buying this and implementing it in their companies. So from that perspective, the fact also then, in addition to things like the mechanical, electrical, and our structural group, the documents, like I said, are a byproduct of this 3D model that are better coordinated. We can do clash detection. But now that we're to the point where we are, where every single project for probably the last 5 years is 100% in Revit, we have all these other opportunities that have presented themselves, like I've already mentioned, energy modeling and lighting analysis, virtual reality. I mean, all those things are possible and so much easier to implement. In 1991, when I was creating a 3D model of a courthouse that our firm was working on in Roseau, Minnesota, it was a completely separate effort from the construction documents to create this AutoCAD 3D model that was completely not flexible. Nothing could change easily. And the rendering software was an add-in to AutoCAD and fairly complicated to use. Fast forward to today, and everything, the light, like I mentioned, the light source, the photometry is associated with the light fixture, and the walls and doors have materials that define not only their texture, but potentially cost and other pieces of information. So yeah, it definitely makes us more efficient and creates additional services opportunities. About a year ago, we created the as-built model for the Minneapolis VA Medical Center, which was a 1.2 million square foot facility, and that actually has all the mechanical and and the distribution system of electrical, not all the outlets and light fixtures or anything like that, but so that was a significant effort, and we structured it in such a way where the client, the VA, was basically from that point forward going to require AE firms to use this system. So we had to basically structure the model so that multiple projects could be happening anywhere in the building at any given time. So that's an example of additional services that have presented themselves from being all in on BIM.
I really love both of those examples of selling and selling the byproduct of the business. I think those are two great examples. And earlier in the episode, Dan, you mentioned that you also sell the byproduct of your mind and your expertise, which is books. 12 books is very impressive. Having
Thanks.
written one book myself, that is quite a feat that I can respect. Not only that, but your Revit training manual is a bestseller, the number one in the academic space, as you mentioned to me earlier before this interview. So
Right.
I'd like to talk about that. How did you start? How did you get into writing books, and how have you been able to do that? That's a lot of books.
Sure. Well, and by the way, I like your book, actually, that Social Media for Architects. That's the one you're referring to, right?
Yep.
So that's a great book for a lot of architects out there who probably aren't social media savvy. I think that had a lot of great tips in it. Well, I started teaching first, and I was teaching at Lake Superior College and looking for a specific textbook. At the time, Revit wasn't out, and I wanted something that covered auto list programming just a little bit, and some other features a little bit more advanced than just plain AutoCAD and geared towards architecture. And I had a postcard that came in my mailbox at the school. It was for SDC Publications. And I picked up the phone, and I think, as luck would have it, the actual owner of the company, the publisher, answered the phone. And I was describing this book, and I think, in this course of this 20-minute conversation, I was articulating what I wanted well. And by the end of the call, he said, "Well, do you want to write a book on that topic?" And there was about a 5-second pause, and the rest is history. And that publisher has just been like family to me, actually. The owner and his wife actually have family that are about an hour's drive away from Duluth here, so they come here every year, and we have lunch together, and it's been a really great ride.
That's really nice. How do you set aside the time to write a book, and how much time does it take? I know the books are of varying lengths, but what kind of time commitment is that?
Yeah, it's almost hard to even put a number to it. It's like a architectural project, especially for a sole practitioner. If you ask, how long did it take? Well, you don't really document every hour that you put into something that's going to have your name and your reputation associated to it. I would say for a while there, I was averaging a new book once a year for a number of years. And all I can say is that when it's 20, 30 below outside here in northern Minnesota, it's great writing weather. It's a great time to be in a nice warm home office and working on a book. Not that I don't like to get out and get a little fresh air, but and then I tend to get up early. I get up at like 5:30 in the morning, and by the time my son's ready to be driven to school, I usually have a blog post written and published. And the other interesting thing is that, as you may know, Autodesk comes out with a new version of their software every year. So right now I have what may be considered the next version of Revit that I'm able to start kind of putting the pieces together of the next update. So annually I update the book so that the student has the best experience. Sometimes there's some pushback because Revit doesn't change that much each year, but there's enough things that if a student doesn't have the correct screenshots in the book and it's not matching what they're seeing, it can be a pretty frustrating experience. So I spend quite a bit of time updating all of those books, except for the hand sketching books. those are pretty solid. They don't need to be updated. So once a year, I was coming out with a book, and then now, depending on actually how much of the software does change, last year Revit came out with the tabs. So this, like your internet browser, you can have different tabs to switch between pages, and now they have tabs, and for me that meant a lot of new screenshots throughout the book, whereas sometimes certain images don't have to be updated because nothing's really changed. So it can vary substantially on how long it takes to write a book. And two of those books were written with co-authors. One of them is an interior designer here in our office. So I have a Revit book that focuses on interior design, and he helped develop a really meaningful program and design that, students that are focusing on this as a career have. It's sort of like a studio on training wheels when they use it in school. They have this opportunity to learn a bunch of really specific, important steps that they need to know inside of Revit and related to building information modeling. And then when they get onto their, self-directed studio projects, they can really do a lot more interesting things like lighting analysis. At NDSU, I have students, we basically get a student version of Illum Tools, which is a professional lighting add-in for Revit. And then they have access for free to the Autodesk cloud services, so Insight 360. The other thing I was going to say that's kind of interesting, 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Autodesk's office in Shanghai, China, and spend a week there learning about the new features that they were adding to a version of Revit. And some of those features actually didn't come out until just this past version. So almost 2 years later, some really significant things like the tabbed windows. So that's given me an opportunity to basically connect with a lot of people at Autodesk, which helps me understand the intent and what the new features are when I'm updating my books. So that saves a lot of time having some of those connections.
That's awesome. What should a small office consider if they're thinking about their workflow, what software they want to use? Dan, how would you advise them to go about that decision-making process of investing in the right software that's going to work for them?
Right. There's lots of correct answers, just like some of your previous podcasts you've had about managing, an AE firm, whether you're using Deltek or some other software. There's lots of different options, and when it comes to design software, I'm a little biased towards Revit, of course, because I have books and that's what our company uses. But at the same time, it's also the industry standard. So when you do have this opportunity to partnership with another firm, when you're on the same software, that makes life easier. But there are certainly other valid tools out there. And we've done some projects, for example, for the Corps of Engineers, where we've had to use Bentley BIM and had to have special trainers come in and teach our Revit experts how to use that software. And it works. Those are valid tools. So it really depends on the firm and what your goals are. There's some residential firms, small 1-2 person firms, that are creating really good documents with SketchUp. With the layout tool, being able to create 2D documents from a 3D model in SketchUp is perfectly valid.
Dan, can you tell me any stories about times when BIM went wrong, or disasters that happened without incriminating anyone? If you want to incriminate them, that's fine. But can you give me some examples of things that have gone horribly wrong that maybe caused you some stress and had to be fixed?
I mean, nothing really major jumps out, like in the sense that somebody did something terribly wrong. I think we've been fortunate where we've kind of eased into it over quite a few number of years, and there's a lot of moral support. Like the people around you are pretty capable of helping you with any issues that come up. But just today, for example, I actually had the day off and came into the office here just to have this conference room to do this talk with you, but had to come in about a half hour early because two separate people were having some problems with corrupt models. And but it can vary depending on the knowledge of a firm, and there's hardware issues that can happen. I can't think of anything that's just like jumps out at me as it was the worst thing ever, at least in our firm. But there are other stories of people, in Revit, there's ways of faking things and in such a way then where you can't schedule them properly or they won't show up in sections. I think because we're a multi-discipline firm, we tend to apply a fair amount of peer pressure to each of our disciplines. If our architects aren't doing something correct, and they drew a reception desk with 2D lines early in preliminary design, they're not going to get away with just leaving that all the way through construction documents, which in some respects could work. But when our mechanical or structural models need to see that information and it needs to show up correctly, there's that kind of synergy that happens that makes for, I think, pretty good documents overall. I was just thinking about a story one of my mentors told me once, where he was out at a job site looking at a building that the firm had designed. And as he's looking up, he kind of, something didn't look right? So he looked a little bit closer and he said, I don't remember there being a reveal right there, big, long, horizontal reveal that like goes across the whole facade of this little building. So he goes back and says, hey, there's not supposed to be a reveal right there, It's the contractor, well, let me check. I swear it's in the drawings here. Let's, flipping through the pages. Well, look, it's right here. And he looks, and it turns out that someone had put a note right on the far side of the drawing, and the arrow went all the way across. The leader was horizontal, went all the way across and pointed at something on the other side. And there you go. It became a reality. It's interesting with technology how sometimes things can unintentionally happen like that. Yeah, there's definitely challenges, and we have similar challenges when we're trying to coordinate between our civil group that's using Civil 3D and Revit, and there's lots of ways in which things can go wrong. Well, Dan, if people want to reach out to you, where can they go to find your books? You mentioned your blogger. Give us the full address of that, how they find that, and get in touch with you and follow what you're doing. Yeah, my blog is bimchapters.blogspot.com. So chapters is kind of drawing on the fact that I write books. bimchapters.blogspot.com. I'm on Twitter, Dan Stine, STINE _MN for Minnesota. You can find me on LinkedIn by searching for my name, and those are the main ways. Great. Well, thanks, Dan, for being on the Business of Architecture. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great. I really appreciate all the effort you put into keeping the momentum going. It makes for great driving between our offices when I spend 3-4 hours in a car. Awesome. Well, be sure to spread the word. All right, will do. And that is a wrap. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dan Stine today. Now, as a podcast listener, I'd like to invite you to 2 free online educational seminars for firm owners. And whether you're a firm owner or you're an employee who eventually would like to start your own firm, you will learn vital, important business strategies and skills from these 2 trainings. The first one deals with how to structure your firm to avoid the overwhelm and fires, how really to go from being a sole practitioner to running a large firm, hiring people, and running a firm that runs smoothly and empowers you, frees you up, and allows you to be fulfilled with the kind of projects you're working on.
I go over all of that in this online training. You can access it by visiting businessofarchitecture.com/freedom webinar. That is one word. The second seminar you can access shows you how to attract the kind of clients that you want to be working with. Not just the clients that come to your door from word of mouth, but really projects that get you excited in the morning, projects that you can be proud of, projects that stretch your capabilities and allow you to really flex your design muscles. Whatever your ideal clients are, they're out there and you can reach them. Go to architectwebinar.com to learn some surprisingly simple, even strange and weird strategies for being able to get noticed in your market, get published, and attracting the attention of your ideal clients. Once again, that's architectwebinar.com. As always, the views expressed on the show by my guests do not represent those of the host, and I make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you conquer the world. Carpe diem.